So, welcome to this final Learn xAPI Hangout on Air. Today I have a crowd of experts with me. I'm very pleased to say we've got a great selection of people who are going to be joining the chat today. So I'm going to just let them each introduce themselves. So starting from the left on my screen, Aaron.
Hi, I'm Aaron Silvers. I'm an equestrian wave running enthusiast.
Ajay, thanks for joining us.
Hi, this is Ajay. I'm joining from India, Pune.
Great to have you with us, Sam. Barry.
Hi, I'm Barry Sampson, professional cynic.
And Ben.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ben. I'm whose fault all of this is.
Next we have Janet.
I'm Janet, and I like the intelligent use of data, and I'm apparently here to, I'm not sure whether I'm here to be useful or beautiful. I think you guys might have the beautiful covered, so we'll hope I'll be useful.
And lastly, we have Will.
Yes, so I'm Will Constantine, and I am a professional Indian chef.
Allegedly, I'm a MOOC wrangler, and my name is Sam Burrow. So I'm going to kick things off with the first question here. So why are you interested in xAPI? Who wants to go first?
Go on, then.
I'll jump on that.
Oh, no, you want to go, Janet? Shall I? I'll go briefly, and then
Okay.
everybody else join in. I was interested in xAPI because we had built Curator. So Curator is the platform you've been using as a sort of central place for the MOOC this week. And a couple of years ago, as we were building it, we wanted to try and understand how people were interacting beyond the level of something of a SCORM like completion, because we really weren't too bothered about course completions. And xAPI presented itself as a standard way to do that. Now I think the opportunities are bigger, and there's a much wider base for us to look at than just doing the in Curator. There's other ways in which we could track and do that. But really, it started out because we wanted to do something with Curator, which is kind of convenient that we've all come together with it today.
Barry, how about you?
I was really interested in learning more about xAPI because I work with lots of organisations who are really keen to make a better link between learning and performance, which I guess is kind of, it's almost the holy grail of measurement within the world of L&D. And I was curious as to whether xAPI was going to help us solve that problem.
And Will, what about you?
So I really like xAPI a lot because I like the tracking piece of the entire learning experience, and not just doing, like, let's say, a course. I like the ability to do everything, encompassing everything. So whether it's informal learning, whether it's formal learning, whether you're doing something like reading an article online, I like being able to see the entire picture of what that person or individual might be essentially learning, and then kind of analyzing that afterwards and starting to look at a trend and see, like, well, what are the habits of our learners that we're seeing, and how does that tie to the performance that we're seeing in the workplace and all of that? Because a lot of times we will access a lot of things that we don't necessarily use from our organizations. We'll use something that we can get to that's a little bit easier for us to understand and not follow the exact rigid line of what learning should be.
Andrew Downs, thanks for joining us. Just a quick name check there. You're on mute at the moment. But Andrew, just moving things on a bit, who do you think benefits from xAPI?
Who do I think benefits? Well, hopefully everybody does. So I guess the most important person has got to be the learner. The learner's going to benefit from, ideally, better learning experiences in the long run, whether that's because there's xAPI being used in the background to power those experiences, or whether it's analytics being used to work out how those experiences could be done better, and then iteratively improving those experiences.
Quick name check there. You're on mute at the moment. But Andrew, someone's feeding back a bit on there. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that. Barry, I know you had some opinions on one of the things you remained unconvinced by was whether or not any of this did actually benefit the learner. Have you changed your opinion at all on that?
No. Well, I'm. It's not that I can't see that it's possible that somehow it can benefit the learner. It's just how directly it benefits the learner. I think most of it, the immediate benefit, is to us as L&D professionals, and then potentially the things that we do might benefit learners. It's an enabler for that, but I don't see any immediate benefit to the learner simply by saying, let's use xAPI to track all the activity they do. It's what we do with that information.
Do you think that's any different to where we are at the moment then? I mean, in terms of like the data that's collected, does it matter?
That's probably still the big question for me, because at the moment I don't think we gather a huge amount of data. The data that we do gather is rarely, I think, the right data. It's mostly just activity, and no one does anything particularly useful with it. I think xAPI enables you to gather all sorts of data. I'm slightly wary of the idea of gathering that whole learning journey. I'm not sure I like the idea of attempting to track everything somebody does, the informal aspects and things, because I'm just not sure how you can do that without ruining the experience for learners. So I think that there needs to be some concern about what it is we track, how we go about tracking it, and what it is we then do with that data. I think it can enable more. I do think it can enable more, but it needs to be done really smart, and it needs a real shift in mindset from the learning design and learning management kind of thing.
Aaron, how would you respond to that?
I think I just want Barry to be my avatar. I agree with absolutely everything Barry said. It is not something that benefits the end user particularly, at least in the short run right now. Ideally, what this does is really benefit the L&D professional, or at least the designer or the creator of experiences, not necessarily learning experiences or even performance experiences for that matter. It gets us out of the, pardon my saying so, but the shit mentality that all we're doing is just making like a slideshow and that's our jobs, right? It is a feedback mechanism to separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of like who actually knows how to actually instruct, or who knows how to actually create an experience that actually makes an impact. And to that end, the professional or the designer or hold on, I gotta mute there. Thanks, Jim. And to that end, we're still kind of in the beginning stages. But I would say this: the fact that we're able to have conversations like this now here, and actually quite often, even in conferences like ATV ICE, shows just how quickly this is shifting mainstream towards the mainstream, I should say. And I think that's a radical improvement, not just for our practice, but for many practices as well.
Janet, does data about learning really warrant all of the investment and hard work required to get xAPI working? Is learning data really that important?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question, isn't it?
Of course it is.
But, what was being said earlier of it's how you use the data. Aaron will tell you that when we were talking about xAPI first over a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, my response was, this is either going to be the world's worst Orwellian nightmare, or it's going to be something fabulous. And I think the potential for fabulous is not instantaneous. I think there's some short-term quick wins you can get from the data, but I think the real wins on the learner side are going to come from the fact that we can look at cognitive science, we can look at usability, we can talk about designing learning for how people really learn, but we can't actually do that until we have a way to assess that. And I think that xAPI is the tool, when we use the data well, that allows us to assess actual real learning experiences as opposed to what we've been stuck with when we're doing learning at scale up to this point.
Jim, thanks for joining us there. How about you? What's the value of data for you?
I don't know if anyone can hear me.
Yep.
Hello, everyone. Apologies, I rushed back. I've got tea on the boil for my daughters. They're upstairs playing Disney princesses. I would love to be learning what they're learning as well and be able to track, while I can't physically see them, what are they doing? You know, which Disney princess have they picked up? What is the conversation that they're two having? It's that digital footprint. It's that story of the individual that we can kind of eke out and infer this is what we think we are doing. And again, with Aaron saying that whole idea that we are all about improvement as a product, that is what we should be doing. How do we make sure that what we are delivering to people is actually improving them and giving them feedback to say, well, you thought you were improving, but actually we can show you through data that maybe you're not improving as much as you should be, as much as the cohort should be, and actually as much as you need to be in order to be moving towards the next stage, the next phase, the next skill adoption. So that's where we're looking at with some of the user. Well, I say we at the moment. It's an individual. It's one of those moments, and Aaron again inspired me with this. It's I'm Brian, and as soon as the next person says no, I'm Brian, it's that filtering down, and as soon as people understand it, it's that feeling of we can really do this with just coding and some server technology. Yeah, it's here, it's present, and it's live, which is a real buzz for me for this.
Is there more interest and more value perhaps on the education side of xAPI application than in the business side? Ben, you just announced some exciting news today about JISC taking on xAPI.
Whoa.
Yeah, so there's some cool stuff happening here where JISC is a large-scale learning analytics project to try and open up a standardized, open way of doing learning analytics to higher education in the UK, and they've decided that xAPI is going to be a reasonably big part of that. And thankfully, they've selected Learning Locker to be the sort of data warehouse at the end of that rainbow. They are really interested in two things. They're interested in retention, and they're interested in achievement. It's quite interesting because, I mean, fundamentally, improvement is education's product as well, but the relation to ROI and things like that isn't quite so tangential over there. Well, it might be in the long run, but you get what I mean. So I think there's a real opportunity there to do something with the learning analytics where learning is the product, where improvement is most definitely the product. The trouble is, well, not the trouble, but the opportunities lie at things that result in money, frankly, right now. So retention is important to colleges, to universities, because that's where the money is at, on retaining the students that they've already gone to the trouble of getting. And achievement is the next one on there, because they want to demonstrate that doing X or doing Y leads to employment and leads to other things like that. So if we can demonstrate a path through to what makes somebody achieve, then that's really powerful from learning analytics. So I'm hoping that JISC, and they've also put out a charter on what you should be doing with data and how you should be collecting it, which is, it's interesting, they've put that out first before they've put out anything else. They've put out how they should be using data, or how they believe they should be using data, before they've gone ahead and implemented it, which I think is the right way around, because if they get it right, they are collecting a heck of a lot of data that could be used for a lot of good, or it could be used for a lot of evil. So there's some real issues there. But education, I don't want to say it's low-hanging fruit, but there's definitely an opportunity there in learning analytics to get stuff going. And I think corporate will have a bunch to learn from what education does.
So is education leading the way more, would you say? Or would anyone else that's got experience with that like to contribute?
There's pockets, but I'll go to Aaron next. There's pockets of university sort of level stuff and research basis. Then there's grants around the place for people to play with it just for the sake of playing with it, which presents some opportunities. But also, that's perhaps not where you're going to get compelling use cases where we actually make it to production. You get a lot of researchers sort of poking around the outside, not really making real-world ready models, which presents some interesting things. And I know Aaron can speak to healthcare and others like that, where researchers led the way. But personally, whilst research might blaze a trail, you're going to need some realistic implementations to make it really stick.
So there are some spots where academia is certainly ahead of the curve than corporate. But there are other pockets where corporate is ahead of the curve than academia. For example, one of the big things that everybody's chasing is adaptivity, or the idea of having to recommend content. Well, at least in higher ed institutions, and certainly in K-12 institutions, when you start to go online, they actually have enough content to manage where you could conceivably find remediation strategies and have remedial paths and actually have recommendations of, oh, you didn't get it this way, so let's present it to you in a different way. All right. So that use case, that simple, well, here's something you didn't get, but let's present that in a different context or with a different set of content in a different path. That's something that you could easily do. Hypothetically, you could do it fairly simply in higher ed. Most corporations don't have nearly enough content to do that, but they want adaptivity and they want all those things. They don't have the investment in creating content, certainly not high-quality content and well-organized and well-managed content, in terms of instruction, to deal with that. On the flip side, though, everybody wants one thing that both higher ed wants, as in K-12 wants, and what corporate wants, is to be able to link what happens from a learning or educational perspective, a curricular perspective, to performance. Enterprise has very solid outcomes that they can easily map to competencies that can be defined, and by trade, there are certain trades that actually all marry to the same set of competencies. You can think about your effectiveness as a project manager, and you could argue, what those competencies are, but one aspect of that is the PMP. That's a certification that everybody recognizes. When you start going over to the academic side, you want to have a degree and have an MBA. Well, every single college has their own MBA program, and everybody's a special snowflake. There is no universal mapping of the body of knowledge that an MBA has. So it's very difficult to talk about what are the outcomes of graduating with an MBA versus what the academic experience has been like for you, mapped to that. And so there are different pieces here and there that I think both together are going to eventually form the whole picture.
Thanks, Aaron. We've seen a lot of really interesting examples and use cases, everything from World of Warcraft to Welsh schools. Which ones, for those of you who are less familiar with xAPI, so to Ajay, for example, which ones have surprised you or inspired you the most?
I think the World of Warcraft example was brilliant, specifically for two reasons. One is because it provides this specific use case of being able to use something which is behavior in a virtual world mapping to some kind of metrics in the real world. So your ability to play World of Warcraft well is directly related to your ability to be able to go out and sell the product or be able to show those particular behaviors on your job. And I think that's a brilliant use case. And I've been extrapolating on, we do a lot of traditional e-learning for a lot of organizations, and we do assessments. For example, we are doing this a small assessment which is about how do you interview people. And it's a traditional multi-path tree structure, kind of a decision tree, kind of a interviewing skill e-learning program. But what I can now do, if I had the ability of mapping it up with xAPI, is to see how many people actually took a particular decision path, how many people went down a particular path and came back, and do all those sorts of mapping and come back and give them much more richer set of data that this is where your managers are probably need the maximum amount of support in terms of their recruitment stage, the questions that they're asking. I think that the World of Warcraft was the most clinching evidence for me that this is really nice.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the more eye-catching examples. Will, what do you think are the biggest hurdles that might prevent wider adoption of xAPI?
I think presenting examples and some of the use cases are definitely some of the challenges that we have, because earlier I was thinking about more, not even just in learning, but organizationally, the use of xAPI in looking at the entire organization. If you're looking from a corporate perspective, being able to track and look at, okay, so based on our organizational performance, what are those factors that are kind of affecting it? Why are we not doing so well, or why are we doing great, or why are certain business areas not doing as well as others? And then kind of trickling down and seeing what that might look like. And maybe it is a learning issue, but then being able to use that technology to leverage the ability to really hone in on those specific problems and fix those problems. So I think one of the issues that we're going to face is probably kind of talking to a senior leader and explaining, like, this is how it all works, and putting it into the term that they can understand it. I think too that when you start getting into it, analyzing those things are going to be very, not difficult, but it's going to be challenging as well to prove, like, here's the exact reason why something might be happening. So that's kind of what I was thinking about a little bit earlier when we were talking about in the actual MOOC during week 3. I was thinking about kind of how does this affect the whole organization, not just learning and development, but how do we use that to kind of push the organization forward and push really our industry forward as well, and not that partnership with L&D, but how has it become an entire business kind of standard?
Andrew, do you think the various bits of technology, the LRSs, are going to develop in ways which make those kind of things easier to deal with in terms of creating better visualizations or helping people to analyze the data they have got?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are products that are getting better and better at analyzing data and at handling data that you might not necessarily be expecting without having to create custom reports and those sorts of things. I think we'll see that developing more and more. Absolutely.
And Janet, what would you say on that subject? What are the biggest hurdles that might prevent adoption?
There are a number of hurdles. I think that a lot of them have been spoken to, of just the demonstrating need. I think not just demonstrating value, but demonstrating need is probably a way to go, because acceptance, interest is your first step. I think a lot of people have a real fatigue of new technologies, new solutions, because you have so many come across your desk. This year this is going to save the industry, and the next year it's something else. And I think people have a real fatigue with that. So I think we have to prove a compelling need and a compelling benefit. And I think part of that comes from really understanding how we use the data, how we do the analytics, that it's not just a numbers game. Competitive intelligence, and the idea that it's not just the numeric data, it's the qualitative data, which xAPI is brilliant for teasing out. And being able to apply those together and showing decision makers and leadership that this data, without extremely complex analytics, can actually reduce some of their uncertainty in decision making and interpretation of what's going on in the organization.
Great. Okay. Well, we're drawing towards the end now, so I've got a couple more questions. So I want to talk briefly about the future. Really, who has an opinion on the future of xAPI that they'd like to contribute? Does it have a future? Surely someone's got.
Don't all speak at once. I'm going to say. So look, I'm invested in. I'm not going to be fair on this because I'm clearly invested in it having a future. I think it depends on the horizon that you look at. I think over the next 12 to 18 months, I think we're going to see a lot of action on xAPI. I do think we're going to see more adoption as more stuff comes out. I feel like we've been through that hype cycle a little bit, and we're starting for people to get some realistic expectations of what they could achieve and seeing those in the real world. So I think 12 to 18 months, we're going to see a whole bunch more about it. Longer term, who knows? I think there's some interesting things which Aaron could speak to about global standardization. I think standardization as a whole and interoperability and things like that are going to be big things for years to come, because we're not going to be short on things that are experiences. We're not going to be short on data. The Internet of Things is going to bring us more sensors, more things that can create data. So standardizing that's going to be important. it probably won't be the only standard. In fact, for this to be the center of our learning experience universe, it seems likely that other standards will emerge and that other ways of working that I can't conceive of will emerge. Will you need a learning record store, or will you just be able to you automatically connect this with that? Is the learning record store just an intermediate step? It could be. Having that data at rest in one place is necessary now, but might not be necessary in the future. So I think there's a really interesting future here. My key message is that we've got a lot of stuff and we need to be standard about the way we do it if we've got any hope of using data onwards, on interoperability, and on remembering what we've done.
Barry, are you convinced that xAPI is the future?
I'm convinced it should replace school. I'm that convinced. That's about as far as I'm convinced. But I mean, I'm probably going to spoil things, but with my natural cynicism about things. I think we're at the mercy of what vendors decide to do, because what we've got here is a group of people who are at least smart enough to be informed about things. We've all come in, we've got involved. Whether we knew much about this before getting involved in the MOOC or not, we want to learn more, we want to stay informed. The reality is that most people who are making decisions around L&D infrastructure in organisations don't even go out and buy things, they are sold things. And they're usually sold things by the people that they've always bought things from. So certainly in my world, in corporate world, whether we see adoption will be down to Saba and SumTotal and Oracle, SAP, all of the big vendors. If they don't adopt it, then we won't see adoption, because you're not going to get the pull from most L&D people because they won't even know what it is. Just like most of them don't even know what SCORM is today.
Yeah.
So,
I think that is absolutely one of the key things. One of the things we thought about earlier as well when we were talking about it. It's really a massive hurdle, isn't it, Aaron?
So here's where I spoiled Barry's cynicism. Number one, you're going to see a consortium around xAPI by the end of this year. Now, it's largely going to be made up of vendors. Now, I'm going to get back to the point about how we're at the mercy of the vendors in a second, because I want to completely shoot that down. But I want to first kind of come back to the idea about how, as you don't see SAP or Oracle ever. Hi there. You don't see SAP or Oracle ever wanting to adopt. Well, as it turns out, there's a group that used to be called HRXML, and they've changed their name. They're a standards group. They mostly work in enterprise resource planning systems, so you're talking about your SAPs, your Oracles, things like that, PeoplesSofts. And they changed their name recently to HR Open Standards, and the reason why is because they're no longer going to be that invested in XML. They're transitioning to JSON. There's a couple of places in which they are actively seeking out to use xAPI in their standards group. Now that means that the very standards in which your systems like SAP and Oracle are based on would then be using xAPI. So we're starting to actually work closely with them, and it's very early days, obviously, but those conversations are actually starting to happen between groups like the groups involved in CMI5, which is basically xAPI for LMSs, in terms of talking about like what are the transactions that need to happen between HR systems and LMSs, and how do they want to send, what information do they expect to send, and what actions do they expect to come back, as a result, and what data needs to come back as a result. That creation of seamless integration between the learning world and the HR world is coming. All right, it's not here today. It may not even be here next year, but it's coming, and the hard work of getting that stuff together is actually starting to happen. Now, to the point about how we're at the mercy of the vendors. I was sitting in an organization in 2008, working for a Fortune 100 company as a high-level peon, and I had an idea because I was really tired of shitty learning. It's the second time I've said shit today. Now it's the third. I Sorry.
I'm going to have to
Oh,
edit
put your headphones on. I don't need this.
you and everything now.
But I was not content to just let the vendors who keep selling SCORM to us or keep selling things that as if the world that is all that can possibly be. All right, and you make enough ruckus and you get enough people to believe in you, and you can change the industry. You can actually kind of start burning down the old growth forest and start actually growing stuff anew, which honestly I think is a really good metaphor for what's happening around xAPI, because it's not just about the technology; it's about finally actually talking about improving our practices as a craft or as a trade. So I reject the arguments that we can't impact the vendors and we can't impact change and that people won't adopt. They will, but it's not going to just be handed to you. You got to want it. And I really, really wanted it.
Cool. So Ben, just because we're kind of drawing to a close now, one last question for you. You highlighted something in the very final piece of content on the MOOC where you said maybe we spent too much time on data, thinking about data in the MOOC. Is it about more than data?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it comes down to knowing a bit about data and things like that, but then you get very focused on learning analytics and measurement and other things like that. You're right with the vendor question, just to go back to the last one. A lot of vendors don't have the level of knowledge that it takes to apply and understand that the problems that their clients are facing are those of interoperability, those of standardization, and those of data. So, when I have this conversation often with potential partners and things like that, they sort of say, oh, well, our customers aren't asking for it, so we're not going to do it. But their customers are desperately asking them for something that can help them out with 70-20-10, or something that will integrate their HR system with this, or something that will get mobile chatting back to that. There are endless conversations that customers come out with where the answer is a standard way of communicating, an interoperable way of doing something. And vendors just aren't necessarily there with the answer. They don't know. That's not true. Obviously, there are a bunch of us that are invested in this and that focus on it. So yeah, data's important, and data's a big deal around it. But I just wouldn't necessarily want to get hung up on one outcome being learning analytics. We think about things like gamification. Gamification's a big topic. Well, if I want to gamify an ecosystem, I want to understand what people are doing in a variety of places. Well, I need a standard way to talk about that. I need a way to gather its stuff and to set some criteria and award somebody because of it. If I want to think about lifelong learning and I want to think about personal learning portfolios, then I need a way to give that back to an individual, and I need to gather data from a lot of different places to get it there. If I want to think about badges, about credentials, about crediting prior learning, then I need a standard way of dealing with that. We can't do much with crediting prior learning because right now someone's got to sit there and go, yeah, it kind of looks like maybe you meet the standard or something like that. We haven't got any legacy in talking in a standard way. So yeah, data's important. And I guess what I was probably getting down to is it's not all about measurement. There is a whole bunch of other things here that clients are asking for, and they're not necessarily asking for measurement right now. So when we come out of it with our playbook of, hey, I've got ways to measure it, they're like, well, I didn't even know I had a problem in measuring it, to be honest with you, because I'm nowhere. But there are other issues that they've got around the place where a standard way of working would make a huge difference.
Cool. Well, we are already overrunning our time, so unless anyone has anything groundbreaking they'd like to sum things up with, I'm going to draw it to a close right now. So thank you all very much. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thanks, Jim. And that's a wrap.